And joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Gary Barker, the International Director and Founder of Promundo. Gary, thanks for being with us. Just how much of that violent male behaviour is cultural versus physiological?
I think we're very careful not to blame culture on men's use of violence, because everywhere that we look, there's as many men, and more, if not more, who don't use violence than men who do use violence against female partners. So we see a lot more cause that has to do with the violence that men witness growing up. We know that men who witness their fathers or another man use violence against their mothers are 2.5 to 3 times more likely to use violence when they grow up. So as you saw in the film here, whether men see their fathers involved as you know, kind of caring fathers or fathers who use violence or model different violent behavior, we think is a key one. So we're really careful not to use culture as an excuse for men to use violence anywhere.
But how do you change those deeply ingrained ideas of aggressive masculinity, same places such as South Africa, as we saw there, or Brazil, or anywhere in the world?
Yeah, I mean, one is to acknowledge, and I think this has sometimes been the challenge, to acknowledge that men's lives are deeply affected and harmed and hurt by the violence that they've witnessed and experienced growing up. Men who use violence have typically seen it, experienced it at some point in their life growing up. This is not to make an excuse for it at any point, but to say we have to understand the harm that's done in men's own lives as they grow up if we want to break that cycle of their use of violence. So what we do in a lot of our work, whether it's school-based or engaging men in prenatal visits, or whether it's using sports and other places where men already hang out, is to tap into a belief that men who use violence are not happy men. They're not men who are finding some pleasure in this use of violence, but that really there is a deep well and a lot of voices of men out there who, if we make it safe for them to speak out, will say, hey, my life has been harmed by violence. I don't want to carry that on.
Gary, you've been quoted as saying that this violence comes from the stress of men from believing they have to be the provider. But that's not always the case, because you have many women these days who are also the providers in families. So is that really a factor?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be careful let's not make excuses for men's use of violence, but to say that among the stresses that men face, we have certainly created a lot more flexibility. That's what part of the women's rights movement and feminism has been about, that women can both have interesting and thoughtful and connected their lives at home and in their family lives, and be providers outside, and that there's certainly a pressure on lots of women to now do both. So I don't want to undermine how much pressure women feel, and certainly those who are juggling childcare together with their professions, we know what that stress is. But to understand that men, particularly in the lowest income parts of the world, to not have access to income and a sense of livelihood and the identity that most men derive from that, to acknowledge that that's a huge strain on men, I think is an important starting point. And again, it's not to make excuses for men. It's to say this is one of the sources of stress that men face. And that's particularly why we're trying to find spaces where we know that stress comes to a fore. So we see that in many parts of the world, for example, there's sometimes a spike of men's use of violence against a pregnant partner. This stress of, oh, now I've got another mouth to feed, is a moment when we see a lot of violence show up. So we're trying to use the prenatal sector, and particularly prenatal visits for women, as a place to also reach out to male partners and provide the support so they don't end up using violence.
So are you witnessing a direct change as a result of your programs?
We are, when we're able to bring these approaches to bear and get staff who are either together with the health sector, education sector, or youth serving sector, when they're able to carry these out in a thoughtful and consistent way, we are able to measure changes. Our challenge is how we go from a few thousand to the millions who need to be reached with this. And that's why we're really trying to think together with UN Women, that launched the He for She initiative, to think together with national governments to make engaging men part of their national plans on ending violence against women. So we can go from a few hundred to a few thousand.
Gary, finally, is there a difference in outlook these days between older and younger men?
I think there is a shift. I think younger men get that the norms have shifted. This is not okay. It doesn't mean that they've figured out new ways and, kind of how to get along perfectly in their relationships with their female partners. But I do think there's a shift. I think that men this younger generation of men have seen seen their mothers and seen women around them in schools and the workplace. I think they do realize that something is shifting there and that this is no longer an acceptable behavior, which makes me optimistic. In spite of the huge numbers in front of us, I'm cautiously or doggedly optimistic that, in fact, in a generation, we should be able to see this reduce, I hope.
Gary Barker, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much.